As a single divorcee living in the suburbs of San Francisco, Barbara Bentley was tough to impress.
I was 35 years old. I was a strong, independent woman. I had a career. I owned my own home. I had a lot of friends. Life was good.
I don't think she was at that point very excited about finding a man. I think she was just happy to be Barbara.
But one night in the summer of 1981, Barbara did meet a man, and a most intriguing man at that.
My girlfriend called me to come and be a fourth for dinner. And that night I met John Perry. He came walking in, very erect posture and his gleaming eyes and ruddy complexion, nicely dressed. It was like, oh, well, he looks nice.
54-year-old John Perry was older than Barbara by 19 years and worked as an international military consultant. But there was far more to his story than that.
He said he was a retired Rear Admiral in the Navy. His father was Admiral Perry that started the Sea Breeze in World War II. And he had stories of how he won the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam. It was a very interesting evening. I had never met somebody so full of history.
I think Barbara was in awe of John when she first met him.
Even by Barbara's high standards, John seemed like quite a catch. The feeling was mutual.
From the minute that we met, John was very attentive to me. He was very focused on making me feel special.
Before long, the two became an item, and John let Barbara in on his past.
John told me that he had 4 children and 2 ex-wives. He said the children were estranged because his military service and he had been gone for too long while they were being raised. And I felt sorry for John because it seemed like he was very hurt about it.
The Admiral also confided in Barbara he would soon be a very wealthy man.
He said he was the black sheep of the family, but he was going to inherit a large amount of money from his grandmother when she passed away. And at that moment, I looked at him and I said, well, money doesn't interest me. Honesty does.
Barbara hoped to meet John's family one day. In the meantime, their relationship took off. Just over a year after they met, Barbara proudly became Mrs. Admiral John Perry in a small ceremony in Tijuana, Mexico.
We went to this very nice restaurant that John knew about, and when the band came on, they started playing Here Comes the Bride. The whole restaurant kind of joined in, and it was very joyous.
Barbara was thrilled to be an admiral's wife. But just a few months into their marriage, her credit card bills began to pile up.
John liked nice restaurants. He liked nice cars, going on vacations to nice places. And we often wondered, how they could afford to do this.
He would have consulting jobs. Sometimes he would make money on it, and sometimes he wouldn't. John was spending a lot of money, and I kept trying to change him, trying to show him how we could budget better. I would look at it as, well, this is something we just have to work on.
While Barbara tried to keep their spending in check, they still enjoyed a VIP lifestyle. But almost 10 years into their marriage, everything would change. By February of 1991, the couple had weathered their share of ups and downs. But nothing could have prepared Barbara for what would come next.
John was offered a job with the government in Egypt, and we were in Washington, D.C. to get our documentation so John could carry on with his commission.
After breakfast on their second day, Barbara went back to their hotel room to meet John.
When I walked up to the room, the door was ajar, and I pushed it open and stepped inside. And I looked over to the bathroom, and I noticed a brown bottle sitting on the counter and some latex surgical gloves.
In an instant, Barbara's life would take a horrifying turn.
At that point, he grabbed me, and I started a battle for my life.
In the winter of 1986, 5 years before her marriage would go horribly wrong, Barbara Bentley was content to be the wife of Admiral John Perry.
I felt that John really loved me, that he would bring me presents, he would cook, he would clean. You know, it was like we had this good partnership going.
But still, she was troubled by the fact that in 4 years of marriage, she had never met John's family or his children.
Barbara wanted so much to meet John's family, and John kept giving Barbara excuses like, oh, well, this person called today, but you weren't here, so I couldn't let you talk to them.
I even wrote letters to all these family members, and within a couple weeks, we got all of them back with no such person at this address.
John said, well, they're just not accepting those. They see who it's from, and they think you're a gold digger. They think you married me because you want everything that I have. And Barbara believed this.
Then, one day in the summer of 1987, John told Barbara he had heard from his son when his war medals arrived in the mail.
John started telling me about each one, what it was and what he won it for, and that his son had finally decided to go ahead and send him the medals. I told him, well, we should get those framed so we can put them up on the wall, and we did.
2 years later, in January of 1989, John proudly wore his Medal of Honor when he took Barbara to President George Bush's inaugural ball.
People would just step aside and let us walk through. The first person to stop and salute us was the President of the United States. It was very exciting. Just the whole day was very exciting.
But less than a year later, the thrill was gone, along with John's medals. It all started when 2 FBI agents showed up at their front door.
They wanted to know if John was home, and I said, well, no, he isn't. And they said, well, we have something here. Would you give it to him? And I said, no, you'll have to come back and give it to him later. I'd been told by John not to ever accept anything. And I just was very shocked that the FBI would be at my door.
Soon after they left, Barbara noticed something strange in the living room.
I was sitting in there waiting for John to come home, and I noticed that the medals were missing off the wall.
When John returned, Barbara asked him what was going on.
He said, well, the frame was falling apart, and I took it to the frame shop. And I said, well, isn't it strange you took your medals with it? And I was more worried about the medals than it seemed he was.
Then, when Barbara told John about the FBI stopping by, he claimed he had to testify at a federal case for work.
John said they called me at the last minute, and so the FBI must have been coming to get some more information.
A few months later, Barbara began to have concerns of a different kind.
John was no longer going to work, wasn't calling any of his business associates, and then all of a sudden he was playing sweepstakes and buying things through the mail. You know, I would get so frustrated because, John, we can't afford this.
By the beginning of 1990, with their debt still mounting, Barbara was running out of patience. Luckily, John said he was finally getting some money from his trust fund. But first, they needed to visit a bank in Florida.
So we were going to meet with the banker to pick up a check. I was driving, and on the way to the bank, John clutched his chest and yelled out and keeled over. I said, my heart, my heart.
Panicked, Barbara rushed her husband to a nearby hospital. Once John was admitted, she called the bank to cancel their appointment and learned something odd.
The banker had never heard of John, and there was no appointment.
Barbara went back to their hotel to search for any paperwork.
I was checking out John's briefcase, and I just didn't know what to think. I was so confused.
There was nothing about their appointment, but what she did find inside that briefcase sent a chill down her spine.
I was in a state of confusion. I felt very frightened.
In June of 1990, Barbara Bentley was shocked when she uncovered the unthinkable in her husband's briefcase.
I was questioning myself. I was questioning the craziness. I was very unsettled.
Why would a retired naval officer need a weapon? When she returned to the hospital later that afternoon, Barbara learned that indeed John had suffered a heart attack, but was recovering well.
So when I got to the hospital room, I challenged him on this gun. I said, well, what did you need a gun for? He said, well, we were picking up this money. And I said, but it would be a check, probably cashier's check.
Then Barbara mentioned that the bank had no appointment for them.
Of course, he had an excuse of why I maybe didn't remember him or whatever. Then I realized, well, here's this man laying in this hospital bed, just having suffered a heart attack. I better back off. So I did.
A week later, the couple returned home to California without ever visiting the bank. And Barbara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very wrong. But before Barbara could question him about the family money, John had some good news about a consulting gig in Egypt.
It was going to pay enough money to cover all of our bills. Then he said that the real good news was I could go with them for the first 2 weeks, that the government would pay my way to do that. And I was excited because I'd always wanted to see Egypt.
I didn't give it much credence at all because it was like, here's another John story. I think at this point, both George and I probably had kind of had enough of John.
Sure enough, there was a slight snag in the plan.
It was getting closer to time for departure, and we still didn't have our special diplomatic passports that we were supposed to get from the leader of this team. So John said that there was some kind of politics going on, and we better fly to see the Admiral in Washington, D.C.
Once in D.C., the Admiral was hard to track down.
We go off to Annapolis, and there's no Admiral, and he said, the Admiral is over at such and such base in Maryland. So we rushed over there, and there's no Admiral there. And this went on and on.
Pushed to her limit, Barbara threatened to leave John in D.C.
I told John that if we didn't see the Admiral, then I was going to go home. I had had it.
The following morning, Barbara stayed behind to pay for breakfast, then went up to the hotel room to meet John.
I looked over to the bathroom, and I noticed a brown bottle sitting on the counter and some latex surgical gloves. And I said, John, what are you doing with these?
John told Barbara that his doctor prescribed him ether.
At that point, he grabbed me, put an ether-soaked wash rag over my face, and I started a battle for my life.
As Barbara struggled to free herself, John tried to smother the life out of her.
And I'm not screaming because I know I can't breathe this ether. And I broke away enough to get to the door and open it up.
But John wasn't about to let Barbara escape.
He grabbed me back and pulled me back in, and he pushed me to the floor and started pouring the ether on my face.
Barbara knew she had to get out of there immediately if she was going to get out alive.
He ran out of the ether, and he's staring down at me with wild, wild eyes, double eyes. I looked up at him, and I said, John, if there's a problem, we can talk about this. And it snapped him out of the trance.
Eerily calm, John made a shocking revelation.
He said, I just found out I have terminal cancer. I wanted to put you under so I could go jump off the Key Bridge and commit suicide. I sat down next to him, and I took his arm, and I just started rubbing it.
Within minutes, John seemed to be asleep, and Barbara knew it was now or never.
She was going to soon uncover the lies and the deceptions, and he was going to get rid of her.
I decided that I needed to leave the room or I wouldn't leave it alive.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On the morning of February 15, 1991, Barbara Bentley knew her life was in danger at the hands of her husband.
I got to the door, opened it up very quietly, and closed it very quietly. I went as fast as I could through the main desk and told them to call the police. My husband had just tried to murder me with ether.
Officers arrived within minutes and arrested John Perry as he tried to escape.
I was really just dazed and just kind of not in reality of what was happening.
Arlington County, Virginia prosecutor Theo Stamos was assigned to the case.
Barbara was traumatized. Her sense was that, okay, there's a huge disconnect here with, who I thought he was and what just happened to me in that hotel room, and why did that happen?
A few days after the attack, Barbara returned home to California, alone. She was determined to uncover the truth about her husband of almost 10 years. She called an admiral who John had worked with in the past.
And that's when he told me, well, don't you know about the FBI investigation? John had been investigated for impersonating an officer.
The FBI had confiscated John's medals, and Barbara was stunned to find out why. Her husband, the celebrated Admiral, wasn't an admiral at all. In fact, he had been discharged from the Navy some 40 years earlier, and no one knew where he acquired his many war medals.
When the FBI agent confirmed that John was not a retired rear admiral, it was like, oh my gosh, he's not who he said he was.
And that was just the beginning.
John had a criminal record for the past 40 years, that he had been arrested for grand theft and for impersonating officers and check fraud and just a whole laundry list of activities.
Even John's wealthy grandmother and 4 children were fictional. But he was honest about one thing.
He was indeed the son of Admiral Perry of the Seabees in World War II, and he was the black sheep of the family.
We eventually learned that John had mounting financial pressures, and he had a life that he had constructed that was really about to fall apart because sort of the jig was up.
It was like unreal that this could be a person who said he loved me, and so I felt betrayed.
In June 1991, John Perry went to trial and pleaded not guilty to attempted first-degree murder.
The opening statement by defense counsel basically was that he was trying to save his wife the grief of watching him die a slow death. The detective and I met with his doctor. He said, no, the guy didn't have cancer.
After only 2 days, the jury found John Perry guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years behind bars.
One of the things the homicide detective found out for me was the location of John's stepmother. And I got in contact with her, and I met with her. She said he had joined the service, and he had come out of boot camp and was with a friend in a hotel, dove into a pool, hit his head, and he was in the hospital for 3 or 4 months. And after that, he had a medical discharge. She said he was never the same. He started getting into trouble after that.
Barbara's ordeal with John wasn't over just yet. After serving only 14 months, he was released on probation.
My attorney told me I was going to have to pay John alimony. I would have to give him half my retirement fund, and I had to pay car and medical insurance on him. And that was when I decided that the law needed to be changed, that was not right, that somebody could try to murder you and then still profit by it.
On January 1st, 1996, Barbara succeeded in changing the law, and her payments to John ended.
I applauded her. She went through a difficult situation, very difficult, and she learned a lot, I think, about herself. And I think mostly she learned how tough she is.
Barbara still lives in California, and today she is happily remarried.
You know, I've been married now 13 years to Rex. He's been very supportive of everything that I've wanted to do. I didn't have trouble trusting again. It was truly trusting myself more than trusting another person, trusting my judgment. I wondered, why did this happen to me?
Barbara has since written a book about her experience.
I decided that I would write a book to help others understand there is light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it takes a lot of hard work to get there, but it's worth it.
Growing up in Athens, Georgia, Margot Bennett knew her career goal was to serve and keep the peace.
I became a police officer, and a friend of mine said, you should try for the FBI. That's where I really found my niche, and it gave me the satisfaction of knowing I was doing something good.
In the winter of 1982, while 29-year-old Margot was finishing up her FBI field training in Atlanta, she met another new recruit, Gene Bennett.
My colleague said, Margot, I want to introduce you to Gene Bennett. Stay away from him. He'll try to get in your pants.
He had this swagger, very confident. He was already doing undercover work, which was almost unheard of. So he was a boy wonder.
In a single night working undercover, Gene helped bring down dozens of criminals and recovered more than $8 million in smuggled goods. The FBI was impressed. And so was Margot.
It is not something that just anyone can do. He had really taken to the work, and he was very successful.
So Gene asked her out, and she initially tried to say no, and he was just very persistent.
Almost instantly, the sparks started flying. But soon Margot was transferred to Kansas City. After 2 years of long-distance dating, she knew there was only one way the agency would bring them back together.
Gene and I broached the topic of marriage. I pretty much said to Gene, okay, now's the time. We're either gonna do this or we're not. And so I guess you could say that I proposed to him.
In the winter of 1984, Margot and Gene tied the knot in a huge church wedding in Atlanta.
I had no doubt that Gene was the person I was meant to marry, that we were going to have a great future.
She was just really thrilled to be with Gene, and Gene was thrilled to be with her, and it looked like they were going to live happily ever after.
For the next 2 years, life flew by for the FBI's golden couple. But one day in September of 1986, while Margot was 8 months pregnant, Gene approached her with an idea for a scam.
He said he was just talking to his informant, and that his informant had this great idea, and it involved using the relocation service to make a profit on a house.
The FBI helps agents relocate by paying them the equity in their house and then selling the house for them.
The idea was that we would assume ownership of a home that the informant had recently purchased, as if we had lived there, and used that house to sell in the relocation service.
Gene told Margot they would split the profits with the informant.
My response to it was that his informant was nuts, that it was crazy, that there's no way we would do that.
Gene let the idea go. A month later, Margot gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and life seemed back on track.
Gene was a great dad. He was the first one to change her diapers. He doted on her.
But little did Margot know that this proud father would become her mortal enemy. 10 years down the road, Margot and Gene would face off in a scene straight out of a best-selling crime novel. It all started on June 23, 1996, with a late-night phone call.
My pastor came on the phone, and he said that he needed my help, that there were members of the congregation, a married couple, that were having a domestic dispute.
Around 11:30, Margot rushed to the church.
I pulled in, everything was dark, and got out and walked up to the front door. All of a sudden, the sanctuary door flew open, and this figure came out wearing a ski mask. He had a gun,
Margot had walked into a trap set by her very own husband.
And I knew right away it was Gene. I knew I was gonna die.
In October of 1986, 10 years before FBI agent Margot Bennett found herself caught in her husband's trap, she and Gene were preparing to move to Washington, D.C. with their baby daughter.
My job was to do background investigations on court appointees. Gene's job was to do background investigation on White House appointees. It was a prestigious position.
But just before the move, Gene brought up the home relocation scam again. This time, he would not back down.
I didn't want to do it, and Gene's response was, you know, don't let the door hit you on your way out.
To save her marriage, Margot went through with the scam. But it wasn't the payday Gene expected.
Gene had been hoping to make $100,000 on this house, but he ended up with only $17,000.
When the couple left for D.C. in January of 1987, Margot hoped it would end there.
I felt that once we moved, Gene would get on a different path than the one he was on.
That spring, Margot was offered her dream job, a teaching position at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She was thrilled. But once again, her husband became involved in shady deals on the side.
One of the rings that Gene had given me was a gold coin that had diamonds around the face of it, and it was not comfortable while I was typing, so I took it off and I put it in my purse in a little pouch.
Oddly, when Margot looked for her ring a couple days later, it was gone.
When I went to tell Gene that I had lost the ring, I really thought he was going to be upset about it, but instead he told me that our insurance would cover it.
Without blinking, Gene filed a claim and received a check for almost $12,000. The following Christmas, he surprised Margot with an identical ring, familiar scratch marks and all.
I was worried that this was the same ring that we had gotten an insurance payment on. I didn't know it for a fact, but my heart sunk.
By the time their second daughter was born in January of 1989, the distance between the couple had grown.
I was hoping that with this other child, our family would become more complete, and that it would be a way of pulling us back into where we were.
But it wasn't meant to be.
He enjoyed the undercover work. He enjoyed pretending to be a criminal. He enjoyed that so much that it was starting to seep into his life.
By the summer of 1990, after 6 years of marriage, Margot had had enough. But she wasn't ready to break her family apart.
I was telling myself that when the girls graduate from high school, I'll do something about this. I'll wait 10 years, I'll wait, and I'll just be unhappy for 10 years.
Margot stayed in the marriage, but in June of 1991, her love life took a surprising turn. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwall had come to Quantico to research her new book.
When I was getting to know Patricia, I called her Patsy. We would get together for lunch, we would spend some time together, and she came to my house for dinner on a couple of occasions.
Soon, Margot sensed an attraction between them, and it wasn't long before their friendship became something more.
I began to sense a different kind of closeness from her. It was something that was missing in my life. You know, it's almost like I was a dry sponge, and she was throwing water on it.
By April of 1992, Margot and Patsy were getting closer and closer. But with her unfinished business at home, Margot couldn't go on with the affair.
We agreed we should stop this and just be friends, and that's what we did.
But the affair changed Margot's outlook on her marriage, and 2 months later, she told her husband she wanted a divorce and temporary custody of the girls.
Gene was stunned. I don't believe he thought I was heading in that direction. He told me he was okay with me moving into an apartment, but the kids weren't coming with me.
And at that point, she realized it's going to be all-out war.
So Margot went to the FBI and told them all about Gene's house fraud scam. In March of 1993, Gene and 2 of his accomplices were arrested and charged with 2 counts of fraud.
I felt like a heaviness about me because I was going to be very involved in the case. I was going to be testifying against my children's father.
By June, Margot was prepared to take the stand. But 5 days before the trial, Gene had another plan in store for Margot.
He absolutely flipped.
She was isolated, hands and feet taped.
And I realized that I might not live through this.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On June 19, 1993, 5 days before his trial for fraud, Margot Bennett's estranged husband Gene had the children for the weekend. He asked Margot to pick them up at 7 in the morning.
I pulled down in the driveway and got out of the car. The garage door came up and he was carrying their book bags. When he got close to me, he dropped the book bags.
That's when Margot realized she'd walked into a trap.
I saw that he had a taser in his hand. Through my head was going, get out, get out, get out, get out right now. And I took off running. He caught me and he pulled me back into the garage. He was wrestling to hold me down and I was fighting for my life.
Margot was quickly overcome.
Gene was using taser on me, on my head. I gave up. I couldn't fight. I couldn't fight it any longer.
He gagged her, blindfolded her, and stuck her into the trunk of her own car.
I was trying to figure out how am I going to get out of this. I was praying to just find a way out.
After driving for nearly an hour, Gene opened the trunk and delivered a bombshell.
He said, here's the deal. They've got the girls.
Gene told Margot that their kids were being held hostage by his accomplices until she agreed to change her testimony.
He made her think that they were in this together, that they had to fight the kidnappers.
He said that if I could convince them that I could get on the stand and lie and be credible about it, that they were willing to let me do that. I told him I could do it.
Gene held Margot captive until it was time for her to testify 5 days later. On June 24th, Margot stunned prosecutors when she took the stand and reversed her testimony. When the judge called a recess, Margot phoned her good friend John Hess.
There was a sense of almost panic in her voice, and which she just blurted out that she had been in the clutches of Gene. She was still concerned that maybe he had been telling her the truth about her children having been kidnapped. And I said, for heaven's sake, Margot, you know that's not true. He's lying. You have got to tell the truth.
Margot told her attorney what had happened, and soon learned that her kids had been staying with Gene's babysitter the whole time.
I knew that I had been had. I had been totally broken down by someone that I once trusted. It was like, what else can there be?
A new trial was set, but this time Gene made a plea deal. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and resigned from the FBI.
Gene was charged with and convicted of the fraud against the government. He also acknowledged improper contact with a witness, but he was not, the idea of kidnapping was not brought up.
My response was, it sounds like my life really wasn't worth a whole lot to know he was getting a year. I ended up resigning and leaving. I used the time that Gene was gone to heal emotionally as much as I could.
In March of 1995, Jean was released, but Margot couldn't break free from him. They still shared joint custody of their girls, and Margot feared he wasn't finished with her yet.
After he got out, I got a job at police department. I never went anywhere without a can of pepper spray and my gun. Mentally, I was just keeping myself on alert. I knew that he was going to come back. I just knew it.
When their custody battle for the kids got underway, Jean snapped once again. On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot was summoned to her church by the pastor. She entered the church expecting a domestic dispute, but instead found herself with a gun to her head.
I knew right away it was Jean.
This time, she was ready for him. She had her pepper spray, she had her gun, and this time, she was on her game.
And so I dove into the pastor's office. I went around the corner of his desk. Jean kept trying to come in the room.
Margot reached into her purse for her gun, but as she looked up, she saw that Jean had raised the stakes.
Margot saw her minister in the next room with a bag over his head, handcuffed to his chair, and a bag of explosives around his waist. And Jean said, "Do you want to die? Do you want us all to die?"
I realized that he was not going to quit. He was not going to go away. And I told myself, I'm going to have to shoot. I'm going to have to shoot him to get us out of this. And the next time Jean popped his head around the corner, I fired.
On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot Bennett fired a bullet straight at her estranged husband, Jean.
I missed him. I missed him by just a fraction, but it was enough to let him know that I was willing to take that shot. He backed off. I was yelling at Jean to leave, just go. Things got really quiet.
Margot called 911 and police arrived within minutes. But Jean was gone.
When we went outside the church, they cut the fanny pack off of the pastor's waist, and ultimately we learned that it was Play-Doh.
And it didn't take long for officers to track Jean down.
He went home back to his house and independently called 911 to report that Margot was trying to kill him.
His home surrounded, Jean refused to come out, and he turned up the drama on his 911 call.
As part of this crazy, elaborate scheme, he had come up with this idea that he had been an undercover for so long that his brain had split. His psyche had developed this new person named Evil Ed, who had come up with this crazy plan to kill Margot.
After a 4-hour standoff, Jean finally surrendered. But even in custody, Jean wasn't done trying to destroy Margot. This time in the media, exposing the Patricia Cornwall affair.
He hated me because it was my fault. In his mind, it was my fault he went to prison. It was my fault he lost his career with the FBI. I was going to pay for that.
In January 1997, Jean went to trial, but his temporary insanity defense didn't hold up.
He was not insane. Insanity, from a legal standpoint, means you don't know right from wrong, or you're incapable of controlling your actions. And the jury didn't buy that.
Jean Bennett was found guilty of 9 charges, including abduction and attempted murder. Although the jury recommended 61 years behind bars, the judge sentenced him to only 23.
The judge felt because of Jean's military service and because of his stellar career in the FBI that there was still some positive about him and that he deserved the opportunity to have another chance.
In the summer of 1997, Margot and Jean's divorce became final. Margot got full custody of the kids.
I was very relieved. The kids and I could pull our lives back together. We could make a future for ourselves, and we didn't have to worry about that anymore.
Today, 15 years later, Margot lives near her daughters in California and is enjoying life as a grandmother.
The events of my life certainly have shaped who I am today. They have made me realize that there's a core in me that won't crumble, that I am stronger than I think.
Margot hasn't spoken to Gene since his arrest, but knows the day will come when she will have to deal with him once more.
I am not going to waste precious time worrying about that. It means that I've given up, and I'm not going to give up. I'm not giving up.
It begins with a silence that no one noticed at first. A silence inside an apartment where a phone stopped ringing. A silence on a block that never slept, in a city that never paused long enough to count who had gone missing. New York, autumn 2001. The air still heavy with ash, grief, sirens echoing long after they stopped meaning anything specific. People disappeared every day back then into crowds, into subways, into their own fear. And that's how it happened, quietly, without alarms, without headlines, without urgency. On the 4th floor of a narrow brick building in Queens, the lights stayed off for 3 nights in a row. No one knocked, no one called the landlord. No one forced the door, because nothing looked wrong. And in New York, looking wrong is the only thing that ever gets noticed. Her name was Lena Hartwell, 26 years old. No criminal record, no known enemies, no dramatic history. She worked late shifts, paid rent on time, kept her life compact and invisible. She was the kind of person who could vanish without creating a ripple, until the absence itself became impossible to ignore. When the building superintendent finally unlocked the door, the first thing he noticed was the smell, not decay, not violence. Just stagnation, air that hadn't moved, time that had stopped. Her purse was still on the chair, her coat still hanging by the door, her shoes aligned neatly beneath it, toes facing outward, as if she'd planned to come back within minutes. But Lena never did. Police arrived without urgency. Missing adults weren't emergencies. They were probabilities. She could have left. She could have chosen not to be found. That was the assumption. That was always the assumption. The apartment showed no sign of struggle. No broken glass, no blood, no forced entry. Just a single detail that didn't belong. A kitchen chair slightly pulled away from the table, angled as if someone else had sat there. Someone who didn't live alone. The report labeled it voluntary absence. The city moved on. Days passed, then weeks. Friends called, family pressed, employers waited, then replaced her. The case file thickened just enough to be shelved. That was how the cold case was born. Not with violence, not with chaos, but with paperwork. Detectives interviewed neighbors who remembered nothing. A woman upstairs heard footsteps at night, meaningless. A man across the hall thought he'd seen a stranger, unreliable. Surveillance cameras on the street existed, but the tapes were overwritten within days. A city that recorded everything somehow kept nothing. And then there was the voicemail. Lena's sister found it weeks later, buried in old messages, no date, no number. Just a voice that didn't belong to anyone they knew. Calm, male, and hurried. Tell her I'll be back soon. She forgot something. That sentence never made it into the initial report. It was written off as a wrong number, a coincidence, an echo without a source. In 2001, data vanished as easily as people did. The case went cold officially after 6 months. And officially, it froze the moment investigators ran out of neat explanations. Years passed. New York rebuilt itself layer by layer. Streets changed. Faces changed. Lena stayed exactly the same, 26, frozen in time. A photograph that never aged. Her name surfaced occasionally. A database search, a tip that led nowhere. A man who claimed he saw her in another state, another year, another life, all dead ends, all noise. And then, almost unnoticed, something shifted. In 2014, a retired detective reopened old Queens cold cases for a university research project. No intention of solving them, just cataloging patterns, mistakes, lost details. He found Lena's file thin, too thin. No follow-up on the voicemail. No record of the chair detail being photographed. No list of people she met regularly after work. It wasn't negligence, it was timing. 2001 swallowed cases whole. The detective traced her routine backwards. Same cafe every night shift, same subway line. Same walk home, predictable, exposed. That's when he found the receipt. A faded thermal print from a bodega 3 blocks from her apartment, timestamped 11:42 p.m., nearly an hour after she was last seen by coworkers. She had bought 2 coffees, not 1. The clerk from that night was still alive. Still working, still remembered her face. And remembered something else. She wasn't alone. There had been a man standing too close. Not touching, not rushing, just waiting, watching. The clerk remembered because Lena looked uncomfortable, not scared, just alert. The kind of look people get when they sense something off but don't yet know what it is. That detail never made it into the case file either. No one asked in time. The detective added a note, circled it. For the first time in 13 years, the file gained weight. But the most important detail hadn't surfaced yet. Not the man, not the voicemail, not the receipt. It was the witness no one remembered to ask. Someone who had been there the entire time. Someone who saw Lena after the purchase. Someone who said nothing until years later, when silence became heavier than fear. And that witness was still in New York. Still walking past that building. Still carrying the moment like a loaded weapon. The cold case didn't crack that day, but it shifted. And once a case shifts, it never stops moving. The witness didn't come forward because witnesses rarely do when time has already decided the outcome. They come forward when the weight becomes unbearable, when the memory stops fading and starts repeating, when every ordinary night sounds too much like the night they should have spoken. Her name never appeared in the file because no one ever asked for it. She lived on the same block, same side of the street. 3rd floor walk up, fire escape rusted shut. Windows always half open no matter the season. She worked nights, slept days. Existed in the thin margin where people stopped being seen. She remembered Lena because Lena had looked at her. Not a stare, not a plea, just a glance that lingered a fraction longer than it should have, as if measuring whether this stranger was safe enough to acknowledge. They passed on the stairs, opposite directions, bodies brushing without contact, the smell of coffee still warm in Lena's hands. Behind Lena, footsteps echoed. Too deliberate to be coincidence, too calm to be hurried. The witness heard the man's voice before she saw him, low, controlled, not angry. Not friendly, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. He said Lena's name like he already owned it. She paused halfway down the stairs. Something in her told her to stop. Something told her to keep going. New York teaches you which instinct survives longer. She kept going. Outside, the street hummed, cars, music from an open window, a siren far enough away to mean nothing. The witness crossed the road, glanced back once, and saw the building door close behind them. That was the last time anyone saw Lena alive. For years, the witness replayed the moment and stripped it of importance. She told herself it was nothing. A boyfriend, a friend, someone who belonged there. That lie held until it didn't, because the city never forgets the sound of a door closing when it shouldn't have. When the detective finally found her, it wasn't through police records or missing person databases. It was through rent rolls, old tenant lists, names that stayed even after people moved on. She hesitated before speaking, long enough to consider silence again. Then she talked, not fast, not dramatic, just exact. She described the man in pieces, height approximate, hairline receding, jacket to light for the season, shoes clean enough to suggest he hadn't walked far. The detail that stopped the detective wasn't visual. It was timing. She had checked her watch as she stepped outside, 11:46 p.m., 4 minutes after the bodega receipt. Lena hadn't gone straight home. That meant the man had been waiting. Waiting where surveillance didn't reach. Waiting where witnesses didn't linger. The detective reopened the street map from 2001. Camera placements, blind spots, light coverage. He saw it immediately, the dead zone between the bodega and the apartment entrance, shielded by a parked delivery truck that night, according to sanitation logs. Predatory patience. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was practiced. The voicemail resurfaced under new light. Not a wrong number, not a mistake, a signal. Someone inserting himself into Lena's life after removing her from it. Someone confident enough to leave a trace. Phone records from that era were incomplete, but not gone. The number traced to a prepaid phone purchased weeks earlier, activated twice, then discarded. Both calls placed within blocks of Lena's apartment. Control without exposure. The detective noticed another absence. No reports of similar disappearances nearby. No pattern to compare, which meant either the man was new or Lena was the exception. Neither was comforting. He tracked Lena's routines further back, her workplace, her commute. The cafe where she picked up coffee even on days she didn't need it. The barista remembered her too, remembered the man who sometimes waited outside, never ordered anything, just stood where reflections in the glass hid his face. Always watching, always leaving before questions formed. The man didn't exist in databases. No arrests, no tickets, no record. That alone narrowed the field. People who leave no trace usually work hard at it. Then came the financial anomaly. Lena's bank account had been accessed 2 days after she vanished. Not emptied, not exploited, just checked, balance verified. No withdrawals, no transfers. A test. Whoever took her wanted to know what she was worth, not in money, but in leverage. Her family had no answers, no ransom demands. No threats, just absence. The detective ran missing person cases backward, searching for survivors instead of victims. Women who remembered being followed, men who remembered being mistaken for someone else. Accounts that never reached police because nothing technically happened. He found 3. Different boroughs, different years, same calm voice. Same insistence that they had forgotten something. Same moment when a stranger knew their name without introduction. All 3 encounters ended when someone else appeared. Lena had been alone. The witness heard the news years later, a brief mention of the case resurfacing, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in over a decade. Her chest tightened, the memory sharpened. Silence stopped being neutral. She contacted the detective with shaking hands and no expectation of forgiveness. She didn't ask for it, she didn't deserve it. She just wanted the moment to stop echoing. Her testimony changed the timeline, shifted the geography, turned coincidence into choreography. The case moved from missing person to abduction, from possibility to intention. But intention without identity is still a ghost. The detective leaned back in his chair late one night, the city quiet in the way only early mornings allow. He stared at Lena's photograph, young, ordinary, unprepared. And he realized the most unsettling truth. This man didn't want recognition, didn't want chaos, didn't want headlines. He wanted erasure. And he had succeeded once. The only reason the case breathed again was because someone else finally refused to disappear with it. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that an old shadow had just stepped back into the light. Once intention entered the room, the past rearranged itself. Details that once felt harmless now carried weight. The angle of the chair, the second cup of coffee. The voicemail that spoke like a promise instead of a mistake. The detective began treating the case not as something that happened, but as something that had been designed. Designed by someone who understood routine. Lena's life, when laid out on paper, looked almost aggressively simple: work, commute, coffee, home, sleep, repeat, no deviations large enough to draw attention. That simplicity wasn't protection. It was camouflage for the person watching her. The detective returned to the building. Same bricks, same narrow stairwell, different faces. He stood where the witness had paused 13 years earlier, halfway down the stairs, and listened. Sound carried strangely there, voices traveled upward. Footsteps echoed longer than they should. If the man spoke her name inside that stairwell, he would have known exactly who could hear him and who wouldn't. That meant rehearsal. Building access logs from 2001 were non-existent, but the logs told their own story, old, unreliable, the kind that opened for anyone who knew how to apply pressure without noise. No forced entry didn't mean consent. It meant skill. The detective tracked utility usage from Lena's apartment after her disappearance. Water shut off 2 days later. Electricity remained on for nearly a week. Someone hadn't rushed. Someone had lingered, or wanted it to look that way. He checked missing items lists again. Nothing valuable gone. No electronics, no documents, just Lena herself. Which raised a question investigators had avoided for years. Why take a person when everything else is easier? The answer lived in psychology, not opportunity. The man had studied her reactions. The barista noticed discomfort. The witness noticed hesitation. These weren't coincidences, they were tests. Small intrusions designed to measure resistance. Predators don't improvise, they escalate. The detective pulled similar cases nationwide, not disappearances, but near disappearances. Encounters that almost became something else. Women followed, approached, addressed by name, then released when conditions weren't perfect. Patterns emerged slowly, painfully. Same phrasing, same calm tone, same suggestion that the victim had forgotten something. It wasn't a line, it was a strategy. A way to create obligation, confusion, pause. Pause was all he needed. The prepaid phone was the next pressure point. The activation location placed it within walking distance of Lena's route. The store owner remembered the beer vaguely, paid in cash, avoided eye contact, asked no questions, forgettable by design. But forgettable doesn't mean invisible. A security camera from a neighboring shop caught a partial reflection that day, a man in glass, distorted, face broken by glare. Too unclear for identification, clear enough to confirm posture. Gait, familiar stillness. The detective stared at the frame until it burned into memory. He shared it with the witness. She didn't hesitate. That's him, she said. Not certainty, recognition. Her hands shook afterward. Her voice didn't. The city had changed faces, but some movements stayed the same. The detective expanded the timeline again. Lena hadn't been chosen quickly. She had been observed weeks, maybe months. Long enough for the man to learn her schedule. Long enough to know when she was alone, not just physically, but socially. Her phone records revealed limited calls, no daily check-ins, no late-night texts that would raise flags. Independence, once admired, now looked like isolation. No one was waiting for her call that night. That mattered. The detective visited Lena's workplace. Management had turned over twice. The building hadn't. Security footage from 2001 was gone, but employee logs remained. One name appeared repeatedly on nights Lena worked late. A maintenance contractor. No complaints, no incidents, temporary access, temporary presence. The name led nowhere at first. A common surname, no address on file. No social security number attached. A ghost. Then the detective noticed something small, too small to register unless you were looking for it. The contractor's signature varied, slightly, consistently inconsistent. A practice disguise. The witness was brought in again, gently this time. She was shown composite sketches built from fragments of her memory, the barista's description, the reflection. None were perfect. One made her inhale sharply. His eyes, she said, they never asked permission. That sentence stayed with the detective. He reviewed Lena's email accounts next, mostly spam, bills, work notices. Then one message stood out and opened time-stamped hours before her disappearance. Subject line blank. Sender address nonsensical. The body contained one sentence. You left before we finished talking. No threats, no demands, just assertion. The message had been dismissed years ago as phishing. Now it read like ownership. The detective traced the IP. It routed through a public library terminal to blocks from Lena's apartment. The library's sign-in logs were gone. The librarians weren't. One remembered a man who used the same computer repeatedly. Always late, always alone, never browsing, just typing. Watching the entrance as much as the screen. He never checked out books. The pieces didn't form a face yet. They formed a presence. Someone who lived between systems, between records, between moments when anyone bothered to look. The detective felt the pressure building, not urgency, but inevitability. This wasn't a question of if the man made mistakes. It was how long he could survive without them. Because people who erase others don't stop. They refine. And somewhere in New York, someone who had once been careful enough to disappear a woman without noise was still walking the same streets, older now, slower maybe, but carrying the same confidence that time would protect him. Time always does. Until it doesn't. Time didn't protect him the way he thought it would. It only thinned the margin. By the 4th month after reopening the file, the detective understood something essential. This wasn't a case buried by lack of evidence. It was buried by normalcy. Nothing about Lena's disappearance screamed for attention. No blood, no witnesses who shouted, no chaos. Just a woman removed from the flow of the city with surgical calm. And calm leaves fewer fingerprints than panic ever does. The detective began tracing calm. He looked for lives that touched Lena's without colliding. People who passed through spaces, not relationships. People who knew routines without being part of them, contractors, delivery drivers, night workers, anyone who moved freely through buildings without being remembered. One name surfaced again. Not loud enough to stand out, quiet enough to repeat. A man who had used different surnames across years, but always the same first name, a name common enough to vanish in crowds. He appeared on contractor logs, temporary IDs, handwritten sign-in sheets that no one ever digitized. He never stayed long, never returned to the same site twice within a year. Mobility without roots. The detective mapped the addresses where that name appeared. The pattern didn't point to victims. It pointed to access, stairwells, service entrances, utility rooms, places where people assumed someone else had checked credentials. One address sat uncomfortably close to Lena's apartment. Another near the library terminal, another near the cafe. The man hadn't followed Lena randomly. He had positioned himself around her. The detective brought the witness in again, this time without sketches, without photographs. Just questions about sound, about movement, about the feeling of proximity. She described it differently now, less guilt, more clarity. He didn't rush her. She said he matched her pace. That mattered. Matching pace builds trust faster than words. The detective replayed the voicemail again, isolated the audio, filtered out background noise. There was a hum beneath the voice, electrical, constant, a mechanical presence, elevator motor. The voicemail had been left from inside the building. Someone had gone back, not to take, to confirm. That realization shifted the case again. This wasn't an abduction meant to end quickly. This was control extended over time. The detective checked the building's maintenance records from the weeks after Lena vanished. One work order stood out, elevator inspection, requested but never completed. The technician signed in. Same first name, different surname. The building manager remembered him vaguely, polite, quiet, asked questions that sounded technical but weren't, questions about camera angles, blind spots, access keys. No one thought to be alarmed. People trust uniforms more than they trust instincts. The detective pulled phone records again, this time searching for absence instead of activity. No calls placed, no calls received, a device that existed only to listen. Prepaid phones weren't just for anonymity, they were for patience. Then came the break no one celebrated. A storage facility in Brooklyn flagged an unpaid unit abandoned years earlier. Inside, nothing dramatic. No personal items, no trophies, just tools, gloves. A notebook with no names, only dates and addresses crossed out. One address matched Lena's. Another matched one of the near disappearances. The notebook wasn't evidence of violence. It was evidence of selection. The detective felt the weight of it settle in his chest. This wasn't a single cold case. It was a fragment of something larger that never fully surfaced because it never needed to. Most people survive by luck. Some don't. The witness was told only what she needed to know, that she mattered. That her silence had not been meaningless, just delayed. She cried once, quietly, then stopped. The city had taught her restraint too well. The detective couldn't arrest a pattern. Couldn't charge a method. He needed a face, a legal name. A moment where the man crossed into the light long enough to be caught. So he waited. People who believe time protects them always make the same mistake. They relax. And one afternoon, years after Lena vanished, a man walked into a precinct to renew an old contractor permit. Older, heavier, hairline thinner, movements unchanged. The desk officer didn't notice anything wrong. The detective did. Because calm, once you've learned to see it, never looks innocent again. And this time, the silence in the room didn't belong to the city. It belonged to a man who had finally stayed still long enough to be remembered. The man didn't know he had been recognized. That was the most dangerous part. He stood at the counter with paperwork folded neatly in half, posture relaxed, voice steady, the kind of calm that reads as cooperative, the kind that survives scrutiny because it doesn't flinch when looked at directly. The detective watched from across the room, not staring, not moving, letting the familiarity surface on its own. Recognition isn't a spark, it's pressure. It builds until denial collapses. The man signed his name, same first name, a new surname. Different handwriting than the old logs, slower now, more deliberate. Age had introduced caution, not remorse. The detective didn't approach him, not yet. You don't corner someone who lives on control. You let them think the room still belongs to them. He waited until the man left. Then he pulled the permit application. Address listed was temporary. Of course it was. Phone number prepaid. Of course it was. Employer listed as self. Always self. But the fingerprints, mandatory now, not back then, were real. That was the hinge. The prints went into the system and came back without alarms. No felonies, no warrants, no history that rose above misdemeanor noise. The kind of record that lets a person pass through life unnoticed. But the detective wasn't looking for crimes. He was looking for consistency. The prints matched older sets taken under different names, small encounters, small frictions. Nothing violent, just enough contact to exist. Different names, same hands. The detective didn't move fast. Speed spooks careful men. He built a net out of routine. Surveillance light enough to feel like coincidence. Background checks that didn't knock. Questions asked sideways. The man lived alone, no family nearby, no long-term relationships. Employment that required access and explained movement. A life that made absence plausible and presence forgettable. Predatory efficiency doesn't need chaos. It needs cover. The detective revisited the storage unit inventory. Tools were generic, purchased legally. Disposed of responsibly, no blood, no fibers. Nothing to excite prosecutors, except the notebook. The dates inside it aligned too closely with moments of access to be random. Addresses crossed out weren't victims, they were decisions. Places where conditions had been evaluated and rejected. Lena's address wasn't crossed out. That mattered. The detective needed leverage, something that forced the man to react without knowing why. Something that disturbed the calm. He found it in a public records request. A notice mailed to the man's address, routine, harmless, unavoidable. It referenced the Queen's building, a retroactive safety inquiry. Old address, old time, nothing accusatory. Just a reminder. The man opened it 3 days later. That night, he didn't sleep. Surveillance caught him walking the block twice. Pausing near the building, looking up, counting windows that no longer meant anything. The detective waited another week, then made contact, indirect, casual, professional. A request for clarification on permit details, a reason to talk. The man agreed immediately, too quickly, calm but tight now. In the interview room, the detective didn't mention Lena, didn't mention disappearances. He talked about access protocols, about paperwork errors, about names. The man answered smoothly, until he didn't. A small correction, a misplaced date, a reference to a floor plan he shouldn't remember. The detective noted everything. Silence stretches people more than questions. Finally, he slid a photograph across the table. Not Lena, not the witness, just the stairwell, old, grainy, familiar. The man's eyes lingered a fraction too long. Recognition. That's when the detective spoke her name for the first time. Not loud, not dramatic, just accurate. The man didn't deny it. He didn't confess. He did something worse. He smiled. Not triumph, not cruelty, relief. You don't have enough, he said quietly. And he was right. There was no body, no scene, no moment of violence preserved in evidence. Just intention, pattern, proximity, and memory enough to know, not enough to hold. The detective let him leave. That decision haunted him for exactly 12 minutes until the man made his mistake. Because people who believe they are untouchable always test the boundary one last time. 2 days later, the man returned to the Queen's building after midnight, not to act, to confirm. And this time, he wasn't alone. He was being watched. He walked like someone revisiting a memory, not a crime scene. Slow and hurried, hands loose at his sides, no hood, no disguise. Just another man moving through a city that had forgotten how to look closely. The Queen's block hadn't changed much, different tenants, brighter locks, cleaner stoops, but the geometry was the same. The angles, the pauses, the places where light failed. Surveillance picked him up 2 blocks out. Then again at the corner, then at the entrance. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street, head tilted slightly upward, eyes tracking the 4th floor windows as if expecting one of them to look back. That detail sealed it. People revisit places for grief, for nostalgia, for regret. They don't count windows unless something unfinished still lives there. The detective watched from an unmarked car, pulse steady, mind loud. This wasn't an arrest moment. This was a confirmation moment. You don't interrupt a man while he's revealing himself. The man stayed for 9 minutes, long enough to satisfy something internal. Long enough to remind himself he still could. Then he left. They followed at distance, subway transfer, another line. He blended easily. He always had. But blending requires attention, and attention creates tells. He checked reflections, adjusted pace. Not paranoia, a calibration. He knew the city. He didn't know it was watching him back. The detective pulled every legal thread available. Old permit logs, old building access codes, old library terminals. He built a timeline that didn't accuse, it aligned. Presence overlapping disappearance, access overlapping silence. Still no body. Cold cases don't break because someone suddenly tells the truth. They break because lies stop fitting together. The witness was brought in again. This time, she wasn't asked to remember. She was asked to listen. The voicemail played. Her breath caught immediately. "That's him," she said. No hesitation now. No fear. Just recognition stripped of doubt. Voice identification alone wouldn't hold up. But it added weight, and weight bends structures eventually. The detective needed something physical, something the man couldn't explain away with calm and paperwork. He found it in the notebook again. One address near the end wasn't crossed out. It wasn't Lena's. It was newer, recent, a building where the man currently had contractor access. A building with a woman who matched Lena's profile almost exactly. Age, schedule, isolation. The detective didn't wait for history to repeat itself. They intervened quietly, background checks. Welfare visit, subtle presence. The woman never knew how close she'd come to becoming another absence. The man noticed. That night, he disposed of the notebook. But disposal is a habit, and habits leave trails. The dumpster he used was serviced early. The notebook was recovered damp but legible. The last page contained something new. A date. A time. No address. Tonight. The detective felt the case tighten around him like a held breath. They brought the man in again, this time not for conversation, but containment. Administrative hold, permit discrepancies, enough to slow him. Not enough to spook him. In the interview room, the man stayed calm until the detective placed the notebook on the table. Not open, just present. For the first time, something cracked. Not panic, anger. "You don't know what you think you know," he said. The detective leaned forward. "Then help me understand." Silence stretched. The man looked at the wall, at the floor, at nothing. Then he spoke, not confession, not denial. "She came with me," he said. "She wasn't afraid." That was the line he crossed. Because people who tell the truth accidentally always reveal the lie wrapped around it. "She didn't go with you," the detective said. "You followed her." The man's jaw tightened. Control reasserted itself. "You can't prove anything," he said again. Maybe not everything, but enough. Because while the city had swallowed Lena whole, it had also kept something she didn't know she left behind. A trace so small it took years to matter. And now finally it did. The trace wasn't dramatic. No blood. No scream preserved in time. It was smaller than that. So small it had survived because no one thought it mattered. In 2001, DNA collection wasn't ritual. It was selective, priority-based, violent scenes only. Lena's apartment never qualified. Too clean, too quiet. Too ordinary to deserve preservation. But ordinary places keep secrets differently. When the detective ordered the evidence audit, he didn't expect anything usable. He expected confirmation of absence. What he got instead was a clerical anomaly, a sealed envelope log but never processed, marked simply miscellaneous property. Inside, a hair. One strand, light brown, too short to be Lena's, found on the back of the kitchen chair, the one angled away from the table. At the time, it meant nothing. Years later, it meant everything. The hair had been preserved by accident, not intent. A rookie tech, a form misfiled, a mistake that waited patiently. Modern testing changed the rules. Mitochondrial DNA first, inconclusive but suggestive. Then nuclear DNA pulled from the root fragment no one expected to survive. The profile came back partial. Partial was enough. The detective ran it through every database that existed. Criminal, civil, employment, permit records, nothing. Then he ran it sideways. Genealogical. The man had lived quietly, carefully, but his relatives hadn't. Cousins, distant branches. People who didn't know him and never needed to hide. A family tree began to form, not a name yet, but a geography, a lineage, a narrowing. The detective compared it to the fingerprints again. Same region, same background, the ghost started gaining bones. When the man was brought in for the third time, The room felt different, less conversational, more final. The detective didn't accuse him. He showed him a map, pins marking addresses, dates lining up too cleanly to dismiss. Then he placed the evidence envelope on the table and slid it forward just enough to be seen. The man's breathing changed. Not fast, not heavy, just controlled less carefully. "That's not mine," he said. The detective nodded. "You're right. It doesn't belong to you." Pause. "It belongs to someone who sat where you sat." Silence thickened. The man looked at the envelope again, then away, then back. "You won't find her," he said softly. "You're too late." That wasn't defiance. That was certainty. The detective didn't respond. He let the room do the work. Let the idea settle that time. The thing the man trusted most had betrayed him. "You checked her account," the detective said calmly. "You listened to her voicemail. You went back to the building after she was gone." The man's eyes flicked up. "You followed her before that," the detective continued. "Weeks, maybe months, you learned when she was alone, when no one would notice." The man smiled again, thinner this time. "She wasn't alone," he said. "She had me." That was the closest thing to a confession you were ever going to get. The detective stood and ended the interview. Not because it was over, but because pressure works best when it's uneven. They charged him with what they could: fraud, identity misuse, permit violations, enough to keep him in a cell, enough to make time uncomfortable. While he waited, the detective went back to the map. One address near the top of the family tree stood out: rural, isolated, a place that didn't ask questions because nothing ever happened there. He drove. The property had changed hands twice since 2001. The new owner remembered digging something up years earlier while expanding the shed foundation: old boards, rusted hardware, a suitcase too damaged to keep. No bones, but soil remembers. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbance patterns inconsistent with landscaping, a shape that didn't belong. They excavated carefully, methodically, without ceremony. They found clothing first, then fragments. Then enough to stop pretending this was still a missing person case. Lena had not disappeared. She had been placed. The man was informed in a room with no windows. He listened without reaction until the detective said her name again, this time paired with location. For the first time, the man closed his eyes. Not remorse, recognition. The city had kept her secret for years, but the ground hadn't. And now the silence that once protected him had finally learned how to speak. The news didn't break like a headline. It seeped. A quiet excavation in a rural county that never expected to be mentioned on evening broadcasts. A coroner's van parked beside a line of trees. A tarp lifted, then lowered again. No spectacle, just confirmation. Lena Hartwell was no longer missing. She was found. Identification took days. Dental records, fabric remnants. A bracelet her sister had given her years before. Cheap metal darkened by soil but unmistakable. The kind of object that survives when people don't. Cause of death couldn't be declared with certainty. Time had done what violence often hopes to do: erase detail. But the absence of defensive injuries told its own story. No prolonged struggle. No chaos. Control maintained to the end. When the detective told Lena's family, there was no scream, no collapse. Just a long pause where relief and grief collided without resolving into either. Knowing was worse than hoping. But hope had already been exhausted. The man was transferred to a higher security facility the same day. Charges escalated, evidence consolidated. Still no murder indictment? Not yet. Prosecutors were cautious, juries fear gaps. And cold cases are nothing but gaps stitched together by belief. The detective returned to the witness. She listened as the story finally finished a sentence it had started years earlier. She didn't cry. She didn't ask forgiveness. She asked one question. Did she know? The detective answered honestly. She knew enough. That was all either of them could carry. Inside the man's cell, calm eroded slowly. It left him in pieces, impatience, irritation, the inability to manage stillness without movement. Control had always required freedom. Now freedom had collapsed into routine. He spoke to no one, except once. A corrections officer overheard him muttering late at night, repeating the same phrase under his breath like a correction that came too late. "I went back too many times." That line found its way to the detective. Revisiting isn't nostalgia, it's ownership. The detective returned to the notebook one last time. The dates now meant more. The crossed-out addresses weren't mercy, they were rejection. Lena's wasn't crossed out because she had passed every test. The final report didn't call him a serial killer. The word was too clean, too cinematic. It called him what he was, a man who selected, isolated, and erased when conditions aligned. No spree, no pattern the public could digest, just patience weaponized. When the case went before a grand jury, the witness testified behind a screen. Her voice was steady, her words exact. She described the sound of footsteps, the door closing, the moment she chose herself over a stranger. No one judged her. Everyone understood. The DNA evidence connected the man to Lena's apartment. The soil analysis connected Lena to the land. The man connected himself through things he couldn't stop saying when silence turned against him. The indictment came quietly. No cameras, no crowd, just a document that finally named what had taken so long to define. Guilty didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight shifting from one place to another. The detective stood outside the courthouse afterward, listening to traffic pass, watching people hurry toward lives that assumed continuity. He wondered how many absences went unnoticed every day because they fit too neatly into expectation. Cold cases don't haunt cities because they're unsolved. They haunt them because they were solvable, and no one knew how to listen yet. Lena's name would appear in records now, in databases. In sentences that closed instead of trailed off, she would stop being a question mark. But the echo remained. A door closing in a stairwell. A chair pulled back slightly too far. A second cup of coffee cooling in the air. Proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a city isn't violence. It's calm. The city absorbed the verdict the way it absorbs everything else, without pause, without ceremony, without changing its stride. No breaking alerts. No countdown clocks. No crowd gathered outside the courthouse waiting for a name they could mispronounce and forget by morning. Just a short article buried beneath transit delays and market updates. A headline that sounded decisive but felt hollow. A photograph taken years too late, showing a man already stripped of the confidence that once made him invisible. Most readers scrolled past it without slowing down. They didn't know Lena's face. They didn't know the block. They didn't know how long the silence had lasted. New York has never been afraid of truth. It has always been afraid of stopping for it. Inside the courthouse, after the indictment was read, the air shifted in a way only people who have lived with unanswered questions can feel. Not relief. Relief implies release. This was something heavier, the sense that time itself had been disturbed, forced to acknowledge a mistake it had helped cover. A cold case, once cracked, doesn't simply close. It rearranges memory. People who brushed past Lena on sidewalks years earlier would never know they had done so. People who shared subway cars with her absence would never feel the weight of that proximity. The city doesn't issue corrections for moments that passed unnoticed. The detective returned to his office and did what procedure required. He finalized reports, signed documents, labeled evidence that would now be archived instead of studied. 13 years of silence compressed into folders and sealed bags. Evidence doesn't feel lighter when it's complete. It feels denser because there's nowhere left for doubt to escape. Lena's photograph stayed on his desk long after protocol said it shouldn't, a quiet rebellion. A refusal to let her become a reference number now that the system finally had one. Faces that wait this long to be seen don't disappear easily once they're acknowledged. The man sat through the proceedings without reaction. No outbursts, no anger, no performance. Calm until the end, but altered, thinner, fractured at the edges. Control, once broken, doesn't shatter loudly. It leaks slowly through posture, through timing, through the inability to hold still when stillness is imposed. During sentencing, when the room expected nothing more than formality, he spoke. Not to deny, not to apologize, not to explain, just to correct. You made it sound like chance, he said evenly, eyes forward. It wasn't. The judge didn't respond. Corrections aren't confessions, but they reveal where truth still lives. The statement wasn't for the court. It was for himself, a final attempt to reclaim authorship over what had been taken from him. Control, even at the end, mattered. The witness listened from another room. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. For her, the case had ended the moment the silence broke, the moment her memory stopped being a burden she carried alone and became something shared, something acknowledged. Everything after that was process, necessary, but distant. She walked out into daylight afterward and stood there longer than she needed to, letting the city's noise settle back into her body. She noticed how many people avoided eye contact, how many moved with purpose without direction. How survival in New York has its own etiquette. Don't linger, don't ask, don't invite consequence. She understood now why she hadn't spoken then. Understanding didn't absolve her, but it freed her from repetition. Lena's family held a memorial weeks later, not a funeral. That word belonged to immediacy, to sudden loss. This was something shaped by delay, by erosion. A gathering built from years of waiting rather than hours of shock. Stories surfaced that hadn't been told when they could have been ordinary. Details no one thought mattered enough to share before absence sharpened them. Her laugh, described differently by everyone who remembered it. Her habit of buying two coffees even when she planned to be alone. The way she paused before doors, as if measuring the space beyond them. Small things finally allowed to matter. The detective attended in plain clothes, unnoticed. As he preferred, he stayed near the edges. He listened more than he spoke. That was the debt. Cases like this don't belong to investigators once they're solved. They belong to the people who lived inside the uncertainty while time pretended nothing was wrong. Afterward, he drove back to Queens one last time. The building stood and changed, indifferent in the way only structures can be. New tenants, new locks. Fresh paint covering old corners that still remembered the geometry of that night. He climbed the stairs slowly, counting steps without meaning to. On the 4th floor, the door was a different color now. He didn't knock. Some doors are meant to remain closed once the truth has passed through them. The man was transferred upstate soon after sentencing. A facility designed for people who had lived too long on control. He adjusted poorly not because of violence, not because of confrontation, but because stillness finally had authority over him. No one there knew Lena's name. That anonymity, once his shield, became his punishment. Years passed. The case resurfaced occasionally in lectures, in articles about delayed justice, about forgotten witnesses and overlooked evidence. It was summarized in clean paragraphs that made it sound orderly. Logical, almost inevitable. It wasn't. It depended on memory surviving guilt, on a single hair not being discarded, on a witness choosing to speak after years of training herself not to, on a man believing time made him invisible and returning once too often to confirm it. Cold cases don't end when answers arrive. They end when silence loses its advantage. And somewhere in New York, on a block that still never sleeps, people pass a brick building without knowing what once happened there, only feeling, sometimes without knowing why. That a place can remember even when a city refuses to stop long enough to ask what it forgot. Years didn't soften the case. They laminated it. Time added distance, not mercy. What had once been raw became referenced, cited, footnoted. A solved cold case is a strange artifact, no longer bleeding, but never healed. It sits in the collective memory like a scar people point to when they want proof that patience works. That silence can be undone. The detective retired quietly. No ceremony, no plaque, just a desk cleared in stages, a badge returned, a box carried down a hallway that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. He told himself he was done with the case. He knew better. Some investigations don't end. They change jurisdiction and move into the private space where sleep lives. He still saw the stairwell sometimes, still heard the door close. On mornings when the city felt especially loud, he walked farther than necessary, letting movement replace thought. He avoided Queens for a while, not out of fear, out of respect. Places that hold answers deserve rest. The witness moved too. Not far, just far enough to redraw her daily map. A new route, a new grocery store. Different stairs, she never told anyone why. People don't ask when change looks reasonable. At night, she slept better. Not perfectly, but better. The memory had shape now, a beginning and an end. Trauma without resolution loops forever. Resolution, even late, gives the mind somewhere to set the weight down. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she had stopped that night. If she had turned around, if she had said something. She always arrived at the same conclusion. New York doesn't reward hypotheticals. It survives on decisions made in half seconds. She had survived. That mattered more than imagined heroism ever could. The men aged quickly in custody. Not dramatically, subtly. Control requires options. Prison offers none that matter. He became quieter, then irritable, then quiet again in a different way. The kind of quiet that isn't composed, just depleted. He filed appeals, lost them, filed grievances, lost those too. He learned the rhythms of the place without mastering them. Some people adapt, others calcify. He never spoke Lena's name again. When a chaplain asked him once, years in, if there was anything he wanted to confess, he shook his head. I already said too much, he replied. That was the truest thing he ever said. The case entered textbooks, not for its brutality. There had been none on record, but for its patience. Investigators cited it when teaching about absence as evidence, about how routine can be weaponized, about how predators don't always look like storms. Sometimes they look like weather. Graduate students debated it in fluorescent-lit rooms, arguing about timelines and ethics, about whether intervention could have come earlier, about whether the city had failed or simply behaved as cities do. No one debated Lena. She was the constant. The human cost no framework could abstract. Her family found a rhythm after the memorial. Not closure, that word belongs to fiction, but a cadence that allowed life to continue without erasing what had been lost. They visited the site once. Only once. Standing there didn't bring her closer. It just confirmed distance. They chose memory over geography. On anniversaries, small things surfaced. A song on the radio, a cafe closing. The smell of coffee too late at night. Grief doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as the ordinary. The detective received a letter one winter. No return address, handwritten, careful. It was from the witness. She didn't thank him. She didn't apologize. She wrote about the sound of stairs in her new building. About how she still pauses sometimes before doors. About how saying nothing no longer felt like disappearance. I wanted you to know, she wrote, that I don't replay it the same way anymore. He folded the letter once, then again. He kept it. Because cases rarely tell you what changed. People do. The city kept building. Towers climbed where older structures had stood. Streets rebranded. Neighborhoods renamed themselves to survive economics and trend cycles. The block in Queens looked cleaner now, safer. The kind of place real estate listings call quiet. Quiet is never neutral. New tenants moved into Lena's old building without knowing its history. They carried groceries up the same stairs, opened the same doors. lived whole lives inside a space that once held something unresolved. That's how cities work. They don't remember, they repurpose. But sometimes, late at night, when the noise thins and the air cools, places remember for themselves. A pause before a step, a hesitation where none is needed. The faint sense that a space once required attention. Cold cases leave residue. Not in evidence rooms, in behavior. The detective spoke at a conference once, years after retirement. He didn't tell the story the way people expected. No twists, no dramatics. He talked about waiting, about listening to what wasn't being said, about how the most dangerous assumption in an investigation is that nothing happened because nothing was seen. At the end, someone asked him if the case had changed how he saw the city. He thought for a long moment. It taught me that cities aren't cruel. He said finally, they're efficient. Cruelty requires intent. Cities just move on. That answer stayed with people longer than his credentials. The man died in custody on a quiet morning. Natural causes, no incident, no final statement. The notice was brief, administrative, the system closing its own file. The detective read it in the paper days later and felt nothing immediate. Relief didn't arrive. Neither did satisfaction, just confirmation. Control had finally ended, not dramatically, not publicly, but completely. That was enough. The case would never be perfect. Some questions would remain unanswered, some details forever blurred by time. But perfection had never been the goal. Recognition had. And Lena had been recognized, not as a headline, not as a cautionary tale, but as a person whose absence had weight enough to bend time. Enough to force a city briefly to look back at something it had learned too well how to ignore. Cold cases don't teach us that justice always arrives. They teach us something harder. That silence is a choice. And eventually, someone pays for it. The city never really exhales. Even at 3 in the morning, New York breathes in short, nervous burst steam rising from grates, headlights slicing the dark, radios murmuring behind locked doors. By the time this case reached its 20th year, the streets had changed names, buildings had shed skins, entire neighborhoods had reinvented themselves. But the absence at the center of this story remained fixed, a hollow space that refused to be filled. Detectives would later say that cold cases do not end with answers, they end with weight. And this one had become heavy enough to bend the people who carried it. Boxes were stacked in a quiet room far from the squad floor, their edges soft from being handled too many times. Inside them, paper had yellowed, ink had faded, and the story had been told and retold in different hands, different fonts, different tones of urgency. Every attempt to revive it began the same way. A name spoken out loud, a date repeated like a ritual, a photograph placed face up on the table as if the person in it could see the effort being made. Some officers felt watched when they did this. Others felt nothing at all, which frightened them more. The forgotten witness had changed everything and nothing at the same time. Their words cracked the case open, shifted the timeline, reframed old assumptions, forced investigators to look again at moments they had already cataloged as dead ends. The new version of events fit too well to be ignored. It explained the gaps. It accounted for the contradictions. It brought the story closer to coherence than it had ever been. And yet, when the lights went off at night and the city resumed its restless motion, the final piece still refused to slide into place. There were days when the case felt alive again. Tips came in after a local news segment ran late one evening, the words New York 2001 cold case flashing across the screen like a dare. People called with memories they had never thought mattered, an argument overheard on a subway platform, a car idling too long at a curb, a face seen once and never again. Most of it went nowhere. Some of it led back to places already searched. A few threads stretched tantalizingly forward, only to snap under scrutiny. Hope rose and fell in cycles so predictable they became exhausting. For the family, time had split into two parallel tracks. On one, life continued. stubborn and indifferent, filled with birthdays, funerals, jobs taken and lost. Children growing up without fully understanding why certain rooms fell silent when the subject came up. On the other, the case never moved at all. It remained suspended on that first day, the last known moment, the unanswered phone call. Every new development forced those tracks to cross again, reopening wounds that had never truly closed. Detectives rotated in and out, each bringing their own instincts, their own theories. Some believed the answer was hiding in plain sight, buried under assumptions made too quickly in the chaotic early hours. Others were convinced the truth had left the city entirely, carried away by someone who knew how to disappear. There were debates over motive, over opportunity, over whether the crime had been planned or improvised in a heartbeat. The files contained all of it: diagrams, timelines, handwritten notes in the margins that read like quiet arguments with the past. The witness's account introduced a shadow figure into the narrative, someone who had brushed against the victim's life without leaving a mark strong enough to be noticed at the time. This person had a reason to be there, a reason to stay silent, a reason to vanish. Investigators traced the outline again and again, filling in what they could with records, interviews, educated guesses. The silhouette sharpened, then blurred. Each time they thought they had it, something slipped. Years earlier, a detective had written a single sentence at the bottom of a report. If this is wrong, everything is wrong. It had been underlined twice. That sentence resurfaced now, quoted in meetings, repeated like a warning. The case balanced on the edge of interpretation. One wrong assumption, one overlooked detail, and the entire structure could collapse back into confusion. Caution slowed progress. Urgency pushed against it. The tension between the two defined the investigation's final stretch. Outside the precinct, the city absorbed the story in its own way. True crime forums dissected the facts with surgical precision, strangers arguing late into the night over theories they would never test in the real world. Podcasters devoted episodes to the mystery, their voices low and deliberate, the word cold case repeated until it took on a life of its own. For some listeners, it was entertainment. For others, it was a reminder that the past does not stay buried just because time passes. There were moments when it seemed the case might finally tip. A document surfaced that had been misfiled decades earlier. A name appeared in a database where it shouldn't have been. A coincidence lined up too neatly to ignore. Investigators followed each lead with renewed intensity, their movements precise, their expectations carefully guarded. And then, as so often before, the trail cooled. The city kept moving. The boxes went back on the shelves. What lingered was the atmosphere of it all, the sense that the truth hovered just out of reach, close enough to cast a shadow. Officers who worked the case spoke of dreams where they stood at the edge of an answer they could not quite hear. A voice drowned out by traffic, by time, by the noise of everything else. They woke with the same thought every morning, maybe today. The witness, no longer forgotten, lived with the consequences of speaking up. Their memory had shifted the narrative, but it had also drawn attention they had never wanted. Interviews were careful, measured, stripped of emotion. They insisted they had told everything they knew, every detail that had survived the years. Whether there was more locked away, distorted by time or fear, no one could say. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, rebuilt each time it is accessed. Investigators understood this, even as they leaned on it. As the anniversary approached, the city prepared to mark another year since the disappearance. There would be no official ceremony, no speeches, just a brief mention in the news, a photograph resurfacing for a day before sinking back into the archive. For the family, it was a private reckoning. For the detectives, it was a deadline that meant nothing and everything at once. In the end, the case did not close with a confession or a courtroom scene. There was no dramatic arrest to punctuate the narrative, no final paragraph that wrapped the story in certainty. What remained was a file thick with effort, a timeline rewritten but not completed, a community still carrying the echo of a shock that had never fully dissipated. The cold case had been cracked open, its interior exposed, but the core stayed stubbornly intact. New York absorbed that unresolved truth the way it absorbs everything else layer by layer, story by story, never entirely forgetting, never entirely remembering. Somewhere between the noise of the present and the silence of the past, the unanswered questions continued to circulate, as restless as the city itself. And until the last piece finds its place, the case remains what it has always been, an open wound in the collective memory, a reminder that some stories refuse to end, and some nights never truly grow quiet.